everybody had a lovely holiday. My name's Marcia Backhurst, and I am doing my TED Ed project on self-determination, which involves two main forms of motivation, intrinsic as well as extrinsic. I'll explain what both of those are in depth, but first we'll go on to the topic, what is self-determination? So, according to the reading, the self-determination theory is when we distinguish between different types of motivation based on different reasons or goals that give rise to an action. When differentiating between different types of motivation, the two main ideas discussed are intrinsic as well as extrinsic motivation. And then up in the top right corner, I have a picture that lists three vital components of self-determination, which are competence, autonomy, as well as relatedness. Autonomy is going to mean opportunity for self-direction, competence is optimal challenge, and relatedness is social interaction. So now we'll get into the differences between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. So intrinsic motivation is going to be the act of doing something that is enjoyable to an individual to gain a sense of pleasure or fulfillment. With intrinsic motivation, there's no drive from external rewards or pressures. That's going to be the main difference between intrinsic and extrinsic, because that is a construct that pertains whenever an activity is done in order to attain some separable outcome, which is a consequence, or avoiding a consequence, or gaining a reward. And then a quote that I really liked was, "The inclinations to take interest in novelty, to actively assimilate, and to creatively apply our skills is not limited to childhood, but is a significant feature of human nature that affects performance, persistence, and well-being across life's epochs." I definitely find that to be true, because with intrinsic motivation, whenever you're doing a task for your own enjoyment, obviously your performance is going to be better. You're going to want to try a little bit harder, and you're going to be happier doing a task if it's something that you genuinely enjoy. And then I really like this quote from Dr. Seuss. I feel like kind of corresponds with that last quote. It says, "You have brains in your head, you have feet in your shoes, you can steer yourself in any direction you choose." So moving right along, I'm going to show two examples from the real world that are similar, but kind of show the contrast between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. I was a huge reader throughout elementary and middle school. It was something that I really liked to do just for the sake of doing it. So this first example is going to resonate more with me, whereas if you were not the biggest reader, the second example will probably identify more with you. So in this example, a child is learning to read throughout their education, and they acquire a natural liking for reading. This child is selecting books that appeal to their own personal interests. They're picking genres that they enjoy reading. And in their free time, the child is reading this book because they're eager to see what happens next. Once the book is completed, the child is going to gain a sense of fulfillment after completing that task, and they move on to the next book in the series. In the second example, the same. So a child learns to read throughout their education, and then books are represented by AR points throughout their school, and there are incentives for earning certain amounts of points. So when a child is selecting a book, their goal is to test on it so that they can gain these AR points, which are rewarded with incentives such as pizza parties, extra recess, etc. The child is receiving joy from those incentives and rewards rather than doing the task of reading in itself. So now I'll move on to my empirical research. In my future career, I plan to be a mental health counselor. So I chose an a study called Perfectionism and the Impact of Intrinsic and Extrinsic Motivation in Daily Life. So perfectionism is going to play into some forms of mental illness, such as OCD. So I just kind of thought this would be an appropriate selection for me. Diving right in, the sample participants were undergraduate students at a Southeastern university who received partial course credit for their participation in a daily diary study. It lasted 14 days. There were several different measurement scales, but the one that pertains most to self-determination is going to be that bottom bullet point. So for the sake of time, I'm just going to discuss that one. So there's a scale from 0 to 7, 0 meaning not at all, 6 to extremely, and then they would take these two quotes, one relating to intrinsic, which was, "I am pursuing this goal because it is fun it provides enjoyment to me. And then there's a quote for extrinsic motivation. I'm pursuing this goal because somebody else wants me to, or because the situation demands it. The procedure, so the survey would be emailed to all the participants once a day for 14 days via email, and the link was open from 5 p.m. to 12 a.m. The findings, so the set of analyses examined the within subject covariation between daily goal motivation, intrinsic or extrinsic, and effect. As expected, when people pursued intrinsically motivated goals, they had higher positive effect and lower negative effect. However, the extrinsic motivation was not associated with daily effect. As hypothesized, SPP positively predicted the slope of extrinsic motivation and guilt, and negatively predicted the slope of extrinsic motivation and pride. So in other words, as SPP levels increased, extrinsic motivation was strongly associated with feeling guilty and less strongly with feeling proud. The SPP did not predict the slope of daily intrinsic motivation and emotion. Limitations to this study would be that it was actually the first one to find a correlation between daily measures of self-conscious emotions and goal motivation, whether it be intrinsic or extrinsic. So I would say that there would need to be future studies needed to kind of support the findings here. And how can this study and its findings be applied to real life? So this is an opinion, obviously, but I think that the study supports the idea that intrinsic motivation is the most natural form that inevitably leaves individuals feeling utmost fulfillment in comparison to other types, such as extrinsic motivation. Because according to the study, extrinsically motivated participants reported that they didn't feel quite as proud as those who were intrinsically motivated to do the study. And how will this information help me with my future career in mental health counseling? This is going to pertain a little bit more to intrinsic motivation, but I just kind of think out of the two, that is the one that I think is most beneficial to people. So with any journey in self-growth, specifically mental health, you're kind of going to need that inner drive, self-determination, and intrinsic motivation to actually get better, because if you're doing something like that for the people around you or because your therapist wants you to get better, I just don't think that there's going to be any real progress shown as opposed to wanting to get better for yourself. And then I listed a few strategies for building self-determination. So I'm actually going to start with the bottom bullet point. Be intentional with the selections and choices that you make. Whether it be with your studies, with your career, whatever the case, if you are choosing things that interest you, that you're passionate about, it's inevitable that you're going to perform better, gain more fulfillment from doing the tasks, etc. So that kind of correlates with goal-setting skills, which are a critical component in the development of self-determination, and then self-regulation skills are also going to be extremely helpful whenever you need that intrinsic motivation and internal drive. So self-regulation skills are going to include setting goals, like I touched on already, developing a plan of action to achieve your goals, and then implementing and following out your action plan, as well as evaluating its outcomes. Okay, and then lastly, I have listed my resources. So I have the reading that Dr. D so kindly provided for us. I've got the textbook, and then my study. Thank you guys so much.